The original idea for this video was a bit of a Mythbusters exercise, and that is, can a chunky mud terrain off-road tyre outperform a traditional American all-season on snow and ice? Common sense would say the big chunky block pattern would actually be good in snow, but no one's really done the test. To find out, I've once again got the generous support of General Tyre, and this is allowing us to go even deeper than I originally intended. Not only do we have the mud terrain and American all season, we also have two different types of all-terrain tyres and a full-on winter tyre to show which tyre really does reign supreme in these really difficult conditions. As always, we're testing up in the Arctic Circle at General Tyre's Swedish test facility. This is going to allow us to do snow handling testing, which is going to test the tyres in the most extreme nature, but also it's going to allow us to do more real-world tests, such as hill starts in both shallow and deep snow, emergency braking manoeuvres, and some real-world driving. As always, there's going to be a lot of data generated from this test, so if you want any more of the granular details, there'll be a link in the description to the Tyre Reviews website. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. Is the chunky mud terrain tyre going to reign supreme as common sense would dictate, or is the more rounded performance of the all-season tyre still going to have the advantage in snow and ice? Only one way to find out. Right, first test of the day is my favourite, snow handling, and it's not my favourite just because I get to fly around in a 3-ton Tahoe sliding it around on snow, although that is a factor. And let me tell you, this Tahoe, while this is the bog spec, non-air suspension, rear-wheel drive only Tahoe, and we have all the driver aids off, it's actually a joy to drive. It's a big old bus, but it's predictable and just a really nice machine, an unexpected pleasure to work with, so thank you, Chevy. As for the tyres, now unsurprisingly the best tyre on this hard packed snow handling circuit was the winter tyre. Who'd have thought? Why was it best? Well, it was the fastest by a significant margin, 5 seconds faster than the next fastest tyre. And where did it make up all this time? Well, everywhere. Braking, acceleration, turning, transient behaviour, predictability, everything you want from a tyre. This General Arctic was a really impressive winter tyre. Like, it surprised me just how good it was. Just a general all-round good tyre. And the next best tyre of the day was the HTS. Now, this was 5 seconds slower than the winter tyre, but it was just as usable. And that might not make much sense because it's slower. And yes, you'd probably get stuck on the HTS in places where the Arctic would just about get you out. But as a balanced vehicle and tyre package, the HTS was remarkable. It felt like a baby winter tyre. So the grip levels were even in all directions. So traction, braking, and steering, lateral grip, everything just didn't give you any surprises. The car did what you imagined it would do, but it just had a little bit less grip everywhere than the winter tyre. So well done on the HTS all-season tyre, the American all-season. Like, more impressive than I thought it was going to be, but still quite a chunk slower. 5 seconds is a lot in this kind of testing. The next tyre was the APT, so the mild all-terrain, and this posted almost identical lap time to the HTS. However, it delivered it in quite a different way. The APT felt like it had a traction advantage, so coming out the corners, you'd squirt out and you'd pick up and it would be great, but once you were moving, it didn't want to stop and turn. So it was the first tyre where this big old Chevy Tahoe felt like it had some understeer issues, and if you'd not driven it on the other two tyres, you might be inclined to blame the car, but it was definitely a tyre issue. It wasn't dangerous in any way, but it did kind of catch you out every now and again, where you've got the grip out the corners and then you're coming to brake and turn and it just wasn't there. It just didn't do what you thought it was going to do. So a good overall time, but just not quite as usable as the all-season tyre. The next tyre was the ATX, and like the APT, it didn't quite have the balance of the winter tyre or the American all-season tyre, but it was usable. Again, 6 seconds slower than the best tyre on test is quite a chunk of time, so it's not the optimum way of going around, and it certainly didn't feel as predictable or as usable on the road as the HTS did, but the grip was there and it was fine, I guess is the best way of describing it. Onto the X3, the chunky mud terrain tyre, and that's kind of where the biggest question mark laid in my head, because I thought with that massive, chunky, aggressive tread pattern, it had a chance of being quite good on snow and ice, and let me tell you, I was completely wrong. It was 10 seconds slower than the winter tyre and 5 seconds slower than the all-season and all-terrain tyres. Where is it losing its time? Pretty much everywhere. It has some traction, but once you start sliding in it, it just wants to keep sliding. It's very difficult to get that traction back. and braking and turning was it was kind of a guesswork. The grip levels were low, and it just surprised me just how bad it was compared to the all-season, all-terrains, and obviously the winter tyre. It just didn't like going on this hard-packed snow. So that's it, myth dispelled potentially. Can you use a mud terrain, or is a mud terrain tyre an advantage on snow? Well, on this surface, absolutely not. But what we're going to do now is we're going to move to some more real-world conditions. So we're going to look at the hill climb, we're going to look at some real-world road driving, and then maybe some lane change manoeuvres, and just see how the data we've found during this rather extreme test translates to actual real-world use.
The braking and traction testing confirmed exactly what we'd already discovered during snow handling. There are 3 levels of performance, with the winter tyre having a clear advantage, the HTS, mild all-terrain and aggressive all-terrain all very close in the middle, and the mud specialist X3 struggling in these heavy winter conditions. Next up, a real-world hill start test.
Okay, the snowy hill test. This one is relevant to the real world because this is where you get stuck or not. Sadly, it's not the most exciting one to film because we literally just go up the hill in small steps to see where we get stuck and which tyre feels better subjectively. We have the 2 surfaces here at General's test facility. We have the packed snow and the fresh crunchy snow, which is about 4 to 5 inches here. So it's a good test of both types of conditions. Starting off with the winter tyre, would you believe it? This was the best tyre on test again. It felt unstoppable, quite literally. It had no problems getting up the hill at any point, and in both the shallow and the deeper snow, it just went. It was stable, it gave you traction, it was the best tyre. Well, the HTS, the American All Season, that was absolutely fine in the packed snow, but it gets stuck a couple of times in the deeper snow. The tyre felt like it had quite peaky grip, so it would give you grip up to a point, but once you'd hit that peak grip, it dropped off very quickly. But when it was spinning, it was very laterally stable. The X3, well, this just struggled in both conditions, but more so in the deeper snow. Got stuck a little bit more times, but once it was starting spinning, it didn't track, so the car was sliding a little bit more, which made it, I guess, less usable on the road. As for the all-terrain tyres, the mild all-terrain, the APT, was a little bit better than the HTS in both conditions. It dug in a little bit more, and it gave you that traction. And then moving to the ATX, the aggressive all-terrain tyre, that thing really carved in and was probably the best on the test other than the winter tyre. It just gave you a nice, stable, usable amount of grip under traction and no problem. So in both the shallow and the deep snow, the aggressive all-terrain was the best, other than obviously the winter. So how do the tyres perform on road? Well, this is probably the most relevant test to you guys because this is what you'll be doing with the tyres. So to find out, we've found a 10-kilometre loop which covers dry bits, snowy bits, slushy bits, but most importantly, the 2 kinds of icy conditions you find out on extreme winter roads. And that's the polished ice that you get at junctions where it's been smoothed over, and then the general rough ice, which I'm driving on now. Best on test, and I'm sure you're bored of me saying this, was the winter tyre. Especially on the icy bits, it had such a significant grip advantage. It was in a different league to the rest of the tyres. It just gave you confidence in all directions, where the other tyres left you wondering a little bit. Steering wise, it wasn't the best on test. It was a little bit sluggish, but that's what you find from a cycled winter tyre just because of the block movement. And it wasn't the quietest tyre on test, but it wasn't offensively noisy. The next best tyres on test were the 2 all-terrains. The APT in particular really suited the car. The car and tyre package just felt like it won. It was a really nice steering tyre. It wasn't too nervous, it wasn't too slow, it wasn't overly noisy, and on the ice, while it was a significant step down from the winter tyre, it wasn't the worst on test, it was the second best. The ATX was broadly similar in grip levels to the APT, but it was a little bit noisier, it was a little bit slower to steer, so marked it down from that. Next up was the HTS. Now this remarkable tyre, this is where the American All Season tyre starts to struggle in the really icy conditions. It was a significant step down from the winter. I guess this is why Americans are now starting to call the all-season tyres 3-season tyres, and then having the all-weather tyres that cover all weathers, because the ice performance just isn't there, and that's where this tyre starts to get a little bit too nervous to really be recommended for these conditions. It was the quietest on test and it had the best steering, but the direct steeringness made the car feel a little bit nervous. So it was one of those slightly awkward tyre and car combinations, but nothing negative about the tyre, it was just one of those things. The worst tyre on test, again, was the X3, the mud terrain off-road tyre. Now this tyre is designed to do one thing very well, and that's mud and be off-road and be very resistant to punctures. But as a result of that, the ice performance was really low, and it was the noisiest on test, and it had the worst feeling steering. So again, the mud terrain tyre, keep it in mud. It's just not performing in these wintry conditions. Well, we came to answer the question, can a chunky off-road mud terrain tyre outperform an all-season tyre in the snow? And the answer is, it definitely can't. It was the weakest of the 5 tyres and really struggled in conditions where the other tyres did have ability. The winter tyre was obviously the best tyre on test, which is no surprise given the conditions, but the 2 all-terrain tyres could hold their own, although they weren't quite as balanced as the winter tyre. The real surprise of the test was the American all-season tyre, the General Grabber HTS 60. If you haven't seen the Raptor video, go and watch that, because this tyre performs amazingly well in the dry and wet and has off-road ability, and now seems to have a really rounded snow ability as well. So General have made a really good tyre with this HTS 60. I'm really impressed with it. Thanks again to General Tyre for lending me their Tahoe and their wheels and tyres and their test facility. Without them, this video wouldn't have been possible. Thank you again for watching. If you've got any questions, please ask below. If you haven't already subscribed, please do subscribe, because there's loads of good winter content coming. And as always, safe motoring.